In April of 2007, a 31-year-old woman woke up from a nap on her couch and rubbed her eyes. But instead of feeling rested and refreshed, she felt even worse than when she'd gone to sleep. She had a pounding headache, and the light that was coming through her window seemed impossibly bright. Her mouth was dry from thirst, and hunger pangs racked her stomach. The woman stretched and sat up. She was sore all over. It hurt just to reach for her phone on the coffee table. She turned her phone on, and when she saw the time and date, her eyes went wide. She'd slept for 53 hours straight. The woman tried to resist the fear that was now rising in her mind. She hadn't had anything to eat or drink in days. Her body had been wasting away while she slept, and she'd been powerless to break free. If this happened again, she might never wake up. In the fall of 2005, 29-year-old lawyer Anna Sumner leaned her elbows against her large wooden desk and stared at her computer screen. It was hard not to let her mind wander. She could see downtown Atlanta, Georgia, right from her office window. Anna yawned and stretched and then forced her eyelids to stay open. It was already 5 p.m., but she still had an important brief to finish before she could go home. Her attention wandered again, this time to the framed diplomas that hung on her wall. She had an undergraduate degree from Princeton, and she had received her law degree from Duke. She'd studied very hard in school and now had worked her way up the ranks at a very prestigious law firm. She was proud of everything she'd accomplished. Anna leaned back in her chair and kicked off her high heels. She was exhausted. Then again, she was always exhausted. In high school, she used to skip hanging out with friends just to go to bed early, which left her feeling totally isolated. During college, she routinely skipped breakfast to sleep in, and then showed up to class so hungry she couldn't even focus. Once, she'd flown cross-country for a friend's wedding, and then accidentally slept through the entire thing. Finding the energy to get through law school had been a constant struggle, and it was even harder as a young lawyer at a big firm where so much was expected of new people. Sometimes she feared that her constant fatigue was damaging the career she had sacrificed so much for. It was beyond frustrating. Anna had slept for at least 12 hours the night before, yet here she was, not feeling rested. It was like she was moving through a fog at all times. She always needed more sleep, but she knew she needed to keep working. Anna stood up and shook her arms, trying to get her blood moving. She opened her eyes as wide as she could. She shook her head back and forth and sat back down, determined to finish her work. But as soon as she started to type, her eyelids grew heavy again, and Anna nodded off, her cheek resting on the keyboard. The next thing Anna knew, she was slowly waking up. Her back ached from being hunched over in her chair. Her computer screen had gone to sleep too. She shook the mouse and the screen lit up, and she looked at the time. It was 6 a.m. Anna had just slept for 13 hours. She was completely disoriented, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and her brief was not finished. Anna immediately felt a knot form in her throat. She had been successfully hiding her sleepiness problem ever since she was a teenager when it began. She'd always been able to arrange her schedule to accommodate her constant need to sleep. But now that she had a job with a lot of responsibilities, she just didn't have that same flexibility. Anna had always prided herself on having a good work ethic and self-control, but now she realized that this was something she really just couldn't control. Sometimes when Anna felt really tired, she would think to herself, if I don't sleep right now, I feel like I could actually die. She knew that was not normal. This problem had gone on long enough, and it wasn't going to get better unless she sought out some help. A few days later, Anna drove to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center in Atlanta. It was inside an old, faded building undergoing significant renovations. In fact, there was still construction going on outside. Anna plugged her ears as she walked past jackhammers slamming into concrete. She checked in, and a few moments later, a gray-haired, round-faced doctor walked her back to a large exam room with chairs and a bed. He adjusted his glasses and then introduced himself as Dr. David Rye, the lead neurologist at the clinic. He motioned for Anna to take a seat and asked her about her symptoms. And she told him that she basically craved sleep the same way a drug addict craves a fix. No matter how much she slept, she never felt rested, and the constant exhaustion was totally debilitating. Dr. Rye nodded understandingly and suggested they begin with a very basic test. He asked Anna to simply take a nap right there in the exam room. And so Anna laid down on the bed. She could still hear the loud construction noises going on outside, but it didn't bother her. Within moments, she was asleep. But just a few minutes later, Dr. Rai shook her awake, and then he diagnosed her with a disorder called hypersomnia. This is a catch-all term for extreme, unexplained sleepiness. It's thought that up to 5% of the entire population experiences it, though rarely at the level Anna was. So while it was a diagnosis, it really wasn't that specific. But for Anna, who'd never seen a doctor for her sleep problems before, having any diagnosis was progress. And she was even more optimistic when Dr. Rai suggested a treatment plan. He explained that in most cases, extreme tiredness is caused by a lack of energy-promoting chemicals in the brain, with names like dopamine and norepinephrine. It's like having a car with no gas in the tank. So he prescribed stimulants for Anna. These medications increase the level of these energy-promoting chemicals the same way that caffeine does. For patients like Anna, it can feel like they have a full tank of gas again. And Anna was so excited about her stimulants that after she left the doctor's office, she went straight to the pharmacy. When she got there, a pharmacist handed her a paper bag with a couple of prescription bottles inside, and Anna didn't waste any time getting her first dose. Sitting in her car in the parking lot, she opened one of the bottles, shook a pill into her hand, and swallowed it. She couldn't wait to feel better. A few months later, Anna grabbed a stack of papers off the desk in her office. Her hands shook slightly as she slipped the papers into her shoulder bag. She stood up from her desk chair, and suddenly a wave of nausea washed over her. She'd taken her prescription stimulants that morning and had been taking them every day since Dr. Rai prescribed them. In some ways, the stimulants were working. She could get through a full day of work without needing a nap, but the side effects from the medication were terrible. She felt jittery and sick to her stomach, like she'd had way too many cups of coffee. She was losing weight because she never had any appetite. And even though she had felt kind of okay for a while on this medication, she was now starting to crave sleep again. As she walked outside and unlocked her car, all Anna could think about was getting home and going to bed. She got into her car, pulled out her phone, and called Dr. Rai. She told him about the side effects she was feeling and now how her craving for sleep was starting to come back. Dr. Rai assured her that this was actually normal. He told Anna her body was building up a tolerance to the drugs, and he'd simply prescribe her a higher dose. Anna was nervous about this. The stimulants were already giving her such bad side effects, and she thought taking more would really only make her feel worse. But at the same time, the medication was the only thing allowing her to make it through the day. So Anna agreed to the higher dose. She hung up, drove to the pharmacy, and picked up more medication. One year later, on a Friday in April of 2007, Anna was wrapping up her work for the week when the phone on her desk rang. It was her boss. He wanted her to come up to his office before she went home. Anna's hand trembled as she set down the receiver. She wasn't sure if the trembling was from a side effect of the stimulants or from nerves from what her boss just asked her to do. She knew what this conversation was going to be about, and she'd been dreading it for months. Anna had begun missing entire days of work without warning and without explanation. Even though she was constantly taking all of her stimulants, it wasn't uncommon for Anna to still literally sleep days away. Sometimes she'd go to bed and sleep for 20, 25, or even 30 hours straight. It didn't matter how many alarms she set either. Anna slept through all of them, only waking up when her body finally let her. Anna got up from her chair and her legs felt heavy. Even now, with adrenaline coursing through her body, all Anna wanted to do was sleep. It took all her strength to trudge down the hall to her boss's corner office. She knocked on the door, and then, in a somber tone, her boss asked her to come inside. Anna sat down across from his desk and tried to stay composed. She felt angry at her body for betraying her. She'd put in so many years of hard work, and she was sure that it was all about to slip away. But Anna's boss didn't fire her. He reassured Anna that he valued her contributions, but he was really concerned about her health. Though Anna rarely talked about it, her boss was quite aware of her sleep issue, and so he recommended that she take a 6-month leave of absence so she could get to the bottom of it. Anna didn't want to do this. She wanted to keep working, but she knew that taking this leave of absence was probably the right thing to do. If she couldn't be consistently relied on, she wouldn't be helping the firm, her clients, or herself. So she thanked her boss for understanding and promised to do everything she could to get back to work soon. The next afternoon, Anna was lying on her couch at home, trying to make sense of her struggles. She sipped on a cup of coffee and tried to watch TV, but as usual, she couldn't stop herself from nodding off. This time, though, waking up was worse than ever. Her head was pounding and the light coming in through the blinds seemed overwhelmingly bright. She had sharp hunger pangs in her stomach and her joints felt stiff and her muscles were weak and shaky. It took all her effort just to roll onto her side. She saw the TV had shut off and the cup of coffee she'd just been drinking was now totally cold and the cream inside of the coffee was clearly rotten and curdled at the top of the cup. Anna was confused and grabbed her phone on the coffee table and she checked the time and date. And what she saw literally did not seem possible. According to the time, Anna had just slept for 53 hours straight. It had been over 2 days since she'd laid down on the couch, but it felt like, a second had passed. Staring at the date and time on her phone, she felt sick. Her symptoms were really starting to frighten her. How long would she sleep the next time? A week? More? How could she live anything like a normal life if this was what happened to her? She called Dr. Rye's office immediately, and he thankfully had an immediate appointment available. As Anna dragged herself off the couch and walked out to her car, she felt weak and clumsy. Walking was like trying to pull her body through sludge these days. She gingerly lowered herself into the driver's seat and then drove straight to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center. Before long, Anna was in that familiar exam room, sitting across from Dr. Rye. He seemed surprised to see her, but when she told him about falling asleep for 53 hours straight, his eyes went wide. Dr. Rye knew that spending so much time asleep could actually be dangerous. It meant Anna wasn't eating, drinking water, or exercising for days at a time. In the long term, this could lead to malnutrition, dehydration, and muscle atrophy. If she wasn't able to take care of herself, her body would eventually quit working. However, Dr. Rye said he did have an idea for what they could do next. It was a last-ditch effort and something he would not recommend unless it was absolutely an emergency, and clearly this was that. There was a test that could help them figure out what was causing her to sleep so much, but for it to be accurate, she needed to stop taking all the stimulants he'd been prescribing. Anna leaned back in her seat after hearing this. She knew the stimulants weren't perfect. No matter the dosage, she always needed more, and she was still sleeping way too much. But at the same time, the idea of not taking them scared her. If she could sleep for 53 hours with stimulants in her system, what would happen to her without stimulants? But in Dr. Rye's opinion, getting rid of the stimulants might be the only way to figure out what was happening inside of her brain. It would take about a month for the drugs to clear her system, so the doctor scheduled an appointment for a month from then, in May. Until then, the doctor explained to Anna that she really needed to be careful. Once she stopped taking these stimulants, she shouldn't drive, just in case she fell asleep behind the wheel, and she should have someone looking after her, making sure she ate, drank, and moved around every day. Anna realized that what the doctor was saying was, without these stimulants, she could not live alone anymore. And so, after she made it home from the clinic, she called her parents, who lived in Mississippi, and she told them she needed their help. Her parents immediately agreed, and her mother said she'd come to stay with Anna in Atlanta for as long as she needed. Anna was relieved to hear this, but at the same time, she was so tired she could barely function. She felt like she was literally sleeping her life away. A month later, in May of 2007, Anna's mom helped her get into the passenger seat of her car. With no stimulants in her system, Anna felt even more lethargic and totally confused. All she knew on this day was that they were going to the sleep clinic to see Dr. Rye. The whole ride, Anna sat with her head leaned against the window, watching trees and buildings blur together as she slipped in and out of consciousness. When they got to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center, Anna felt so stiff and heavy that her mom had to help her get out of the car. Anna could barely keep her eyes open as she leaned on her mom's arm, and then she shuffled her way into the clinic, feeling like she had cinder blocks stuck to her feet. Dr. Rye met Anna in the waiting area and walked her back to an exam room. They sat down, Dr. Rye in a chair and Anna on the bed. And as soon as Anna was sitting down, she started to feel herself beginning to fall asleep. As she struggled to stay awake, Dr. Rye explained the procedure they'd be doing that day. He said sleep was largely controlled by a person's brain. The brain uses nerves and chemicals to send messages through the rest of the body, and if the balance of these chemicals is thrown off, it could make someone sleep far too little or far too much. Dr. Rye thought this could be what was happening to Anna, but he needed to analyze the fluid inside her spinal cord to be sure. This meant he would need to insert a needle into the base of her spine and withdraw some of the fluid, a procedure known as a spinal tap. Dr. Rye instructed Anna to lay down on the bed in the fetal position with her back facing him. Then he injected a local anesthetic near her spine, and Anna's back went numb. Then Anna began to feel pressure and a burning sensation as Dr. Rye inserted the needle into her spine and removed a sample of her cerebrospinal fluid. When the procedure was over, Dr. Rye told Anna it would take a few days for the results to come back. And so Anna stood, her back numb and her whole body exhausted, and she shuffled out to the waiting room where her parents were sitting. Then the parents helped Anna out to the car, they got inside, and they drove back to Anna's house in Atlanta. Anna barely made it inside before she collapsed into bed and fell asleep. A few days later, Dr. Rye was getting ready to leave work to head home when one of his assistants rushed inside and told him that the results of Anna's test had come in. Dr. Rye adjusted his glasses and then peered down at the data on his computer screen. He reviewed the chemical breakdown of Anna's cerebrospinal fluid, and what he saw shocked him so much that he called over other doctors to take a look. Every sleep specialist at the clinic was totally surprised. The results were so bizarre that one doctor even started laughing at the absurdity of the numbers they were seeing. They had literally never seen anything like this. But while the other doctors stood in disbelief, Dr. Rye felt a mixture of hope and unease. He had seen results like this before, in an Italian sleep study from the 1990s. In that study, a group of people who had symptoms similar to Anna's were given an experimental drug that cured their sleepiness. It was a drug that Dr. Rye had on hand, which meant he might be able to use it to cure Anna too. But there were problems that made Dr. Rye hesitant. That Italian study had been discredited after the research was found to have some serious issues. Plus, the drug used in that study to cure their sleepiness was never approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat sleep disorders, and it could cause bad side effects like seizures, so giving it to Anna would definitely be a risk. But faced with Anna's spinal tap results, Dr. Rye thought the risk was worth it, and so he called Anna and told her that he might be able to treat her sleepiness, but they need to do one more test. The next month, in June of 2007, Anna came back to the Emory Clinic. She'd been off the stimulants now for 2 months, and it felt like her body was close to shutting down on her, like she'd never be able to do anything except sleep again. Every footstep she took was a total battle. She dragged herself into the exam room and crawled into the bed. She felt a nurse lift her arm, swab near her wrist, and then jab her with an IV needle. Anna was vaguely aware of other movement in the room. Multiple nurses were standing by, just in case Anna had a bad reaction to the drug, like a seizure or worse. Anna watched as Dr. Rye rolled a screen into the room. Everything looked slightly blurry to her. She heard Dr. Rye say they were doing a test to measure her brain's reaction time, and then he put a remote in her hand and told her to press the button as soon as she saw numbers appear on this screen. Anna tried to follow his instructions, but at the same time, she felt herself drifting in and out of consciousness, and so when a number popped up, she would press the button like she was told to, but she could tell by the look on Dr. Rye's face that she was not doing a good job. After the test was over, Dr. Rye told Anna that her reaction times were similar to someone who had just been up all night, or who had been drinking very heavily. And so now that they had these control results, they could try the medication that Dr. Rye hoped would help her. Anna watched as Dr. Rye put something into her IV bag. The liquid dripped through the tube into her arm and into her bloodstream. But Anna didn't feel any better. Her head felt like a lead weight. Her eyes were so dry that they burned, and the whole room seemed foggy. It took everything in her not to slump over and let her eyes close. For a moment, she had a horrible feeling that this new treatment was not going to work. She would never be able to hold a job, or even live by herself again. Then she heard Dr. Rye's voice at her side saying he was going to try a higher dose of this drug. Anna struggled to take a deep breath. She waited for something to happen. Then her eyelids snapped open. The room came into focus, and Anna felt like she could hear and see again, and she didn't feel a desperate urge to sleep. Dr. Rye ran the reaction time test again, and Anna didn't have to work to focus on the screen. The reflex test that had seemed impossible before felt very simple now. When they were finished, Anna looked up at Dr. Rye, close to tears, and she told him she felt alive. For the first time in her adult life, Anna felt truly awake. Dr. Rye watched Anna for a moment. In all the time he'd known her, he'd never seen her look this alert. She sat up straight, her eyes were clear and focused, and she was smiling at him. He couldn't help but smile back. It was incredible to see how much of a difference this drug was making. Dr. Rye sat down next to Anna and told her that he had never seen a patient like her before. Her brain was basically full of naturally occurring anesthesia. He explained that there's a chemical messenger in everyone's brains known as GABA, G-A-B-A, that helps regulate sleep. Many sleep aids and drugs used for surgical anesthesia make the brain respond more strongly to GABA. The stronger the response, the sleepier a person gets, Dr. Rye said. And the reason Anna's doctors were so shocked by her test results was because her naturally occurring GABA activity levels were as high as a person who was about to go into surgery. Every day of her life, 24 hours a day, Anna was walking around with the same level of sedation as a person about to have all their wisdom teeth removed. Dr. Rye watched Anna's jaw drop as she realized that she hadn't just been tired for most of her life. Her own brain had been literally knocking her out. This drug that Dr. Rye had given her was called flumazenil. Usually, flumazenil is used in hospitals to help people who are overdosing on sedatives or having trouble waking up from anesthesia. It's an emergency antidote for people whose GABA activity is too high. So for Anna, whose GABA activity was always too high, flumazenil made her brain function like a healthy person's brain. But the FDA never approved flumazenil for excessive sleepiness. The drug only came as an intravenous medication for use in hospitals, and the effects wore off really quickly. Anna would need to have intravenous injections every few hours to stay awake, and that just wasn't possible from a practical standpoint. So Dr. Rye worked with Anna and the drug maker over the next 8 months to get an exemption from the FDA that would allow her to take a daily flumazenil pill to prevent her sleepiness. The medication completely changed Anna's life. She's since gone back to work, been promoted to partner at the big prestigious law firm in Atlanta, and is enjoying what she calls, quote, the luxury of life. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer waited anxiously at a long metal table in the visitors area of a maximum security prison in Virginia. He had driven 2 hours from North Carolina to see a prisoner who had committed a gruesome murder. When that inmate finally approached the doctor, Benjamin saw a thin, sickly-looking man who, according to those who knew him, had once been a kind and gentle person. Something had clearly turned him into a cold-blooded killer. Benjamin wasn't sure how or why, but he was determined to find out. One morning in the spring of 2009, 39-year-old Dr. Benjamin Gilmer quietly got dressed before dawn without waking his sleeping wife and young son. He walked out the front door of his home in Asheville, North Carolina. He got in his car and pulled off into the foggy morning. Benjamin drove about 15 miles until the city streets became narrow country roads. In the distance, he saw the peaks of green mountains jutting into the sky. The area was breathtaking. But Benjamin's stomach was in knots. He was about to start his new job as a doctor at the Cane Creek Clinic, a rural medical center in the small town of Fletcher. A few minutes later, Benjamin turned off the main road and into the driveway of an old repurposed farmhouse. The farmhouse was the clinic's location, which had been founded by another doctor whose last name was Gilmer, except this doctor's name was Vince Gilmer. Benjamin found it odd that he happened to share the same last name as the previous doctor. He knew it would confuse some patients. In fact, having the same last name as the clinic's founder had almost kept him from getting the job. The board of directors was hesitant to hire him because the first Dr. Gilmer had done something so heinous that they wanted to completely disassociate themselves from that name. Dr. Vince Gilmer had murdered his own father and mutilated the corpse 5 years earlier on June 28, 2004. He was now serving a life sentence in prison. Benjamin Gilmer understood why having the same last name as this killer would give the board of directors pause. But Benjamin was grateful that they gave him a chance. His goal wasn't to work in a big hospital or make a ton of money, it was to help people who needed it most in small communities. Benjamin parked, then got out of his car and walked toward the clinic. He took a deep breath and then stepped through the creaky front door. The clinic wouldn't open for another 10 minutes, but there were already a handful of people sitting in the waiting area reading the local paper. A few people glanced up at him, but no one gave him a strange look. He smiled and waved back, relieved that he didn't seem to be causing any confusion. Benjamin headed into the back and greeted his staff, who had already been told Benjamin was not related to the other Dr. Gilmer. Benjamin checked his busy schedule. He had back-to-back-to-back appointments from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. He refilled his coffee mug, put on his white coat, and got to work. By the end of the day, 6 p.m., he was tired and ready to go home. But he had one more patient to see, a woman who was there for a follow-up on her arthritis. But when he walked into the exam room, he was startled by what he saw. The woman was sitting on the exam table with her head down almost to her knees, and she was hyperventilating. Her breaths were shallow and her face was pale. She was clearly having a panic attack. But as soon as Benjamin stepped all the way into the room and shut the door, the woman looked up at him and visibly began to relax. Her breathing slowed down, and her color started to come back. Once she had steadied herself, she reached out and touched Benjamin's shoulder and apologized. When the nurse had first mentioned she'd be seeing Dr. Gilmer, she was terrified because she thought it would be the other Dr. Gilmer, the murderer. Benjamin smiled and told her it was all right, he was just glad she was feeling better. Once the woman was ready, Benjamin began to examine her, and as he checked her vitals, they talked about the other Dr. Gilmer, Vince Gilmer. Despite her fear that it was going to be the first Dr. Gilmer walking into the exam room, she had said to the new Dr. Gilmer that she actually only had fond memories of Vince Gilmer. She remembered Vince as being very kind and caring before she found out he had murdered his father. One time when she was at the clinic, she'd seen Vince rescue a mouse from a no-kill mousetrap. Then he walked out back and released it right next to a koi pond he'd built himself. He cared deeply about every living thing, which had made his crime all the more shocking to her. Benjamin thanked her for being so open. He prescribed some medication for her arthritis, walked her back to the waiting room, and then he returned to his office. Benjamin wrote up his patient notes from the day, and then he left the clinic. But on the way home, he kept thinking about Vince Gilmer. He wondered how a man who had been a doctor, committed to saving lives, was now serving a life sentence for murder. His mind wandered as the trees on the side of the highway whipped by. Benjamin blinked and forced his eyes to stay on the road. He didn't want to think about a murderer, especially one who shared his last name. Finally, Benjamin arrived home, he had some dinner, and then he crawled into bed and fell asleep. Over the next several months, Benjamin tried to push thoughts of Vince Gilmer out of his head. Taking over the clinic was a demanding job, and Benjamin often worked 14-hour days. But even when he was busy, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Vince's story. Time and time again, longtime patients who came into the clinic who had known Vince Gilmer would tell Benjamin about Vince's generosity and compassion, how he would take payment in the form of corn and tomatoes from patients who could not afford to pay the bill, how he still made house calls, how he treated everyone with decency and respect. Benjamin just couldn't believe someone like Vince could transform into a violent criminal with no explanation. He wondered if there could be a medical explanation for Vince to snap and become this killer. Did something break inside of him? Until he knew more, Benjamin just could not let it go. A few weeks later, Benjamin's receptionist walked into the clinic with a stack of newspaper articles about Vince Gilmer. She knew about Benjamin's interest in the case and had done some research on her own at the local library. Benjamin eagerly sat down at his desk at the end of the day, clearing away his medical reports and charts to focus on the newspapers. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was excited to find out any new information about Vince Gilmer that was not just word of mouth. As he read the articles, Benjamin discovered that Vince had actually been about Benjamin's age when he killed his father, Dalton Gilmer, 5 years ago. Dalton had been diagnosed with some form of schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, which is a form of dementia. He had been living in a psychiatric hospital that treated Alzheimer's patients. The part about schizophrenia caught Benjamin's attention. He wondered if Vince inherited a genetic vulnerability to the crippling mental disorder. But as he thought more about the possible link, it seemed unlikely. Schizophrenia typically appears in early adulthood, and he doubted that Vince could have developed the disease without any prior signs. There are some cases that appear later in life, but they're rare. Whatever changed in Vince had changed suddenly. Benjamin kept reading. On the day of the murder, Vince was supposed to come help his father, Dalton, move to a nursing home, and witnesses saw him come pick Dalton up. But 2 days later, Vince reported his father missing, claiming he'd brought his father back home, and then he'd probably just wandered off. Vince had no idea that the police had already found his dad's body on a road 2 hours' drive from the hospital, and there was evidence linking Vince to the murder. The articles said that Vince had told police during the investigation that he had not been feeling like himself lately because he was withdrawing from an antidepressant medication called Lexapro. People who suddenly stop taking antidepressants can experience a range of symptoms, including trouble sleeping, nausea, and psychological reactions such as suicidal impulses or psychosis. The articles also said that Vince had gotten seriously injured in a car accident about a year before the murder, and after that, he and his wife had divorced. Now, Benjamin's mind was racing. Was it possible that the combined effects of antidepressant withdrawal and a bad head injury from a car accident could have dramatically altered Vince's personality? Could they have transformed him into a murderer? It was getting late, and he should have been home by now. His wife was probably wondering where he was. But before Benjamin shut off his light, he noticed a blurry photo of Vince from one of the articles. He looked big and burly. He had a shaved head, and he was wearing a prison jumpsuit. His eyes seemed haunted. Benjamin suddenly felt like he was trying to build a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces, but he didn't have the time to figure out what he was missing. Over the next year, Benjamin's life got much more hectic. He and his wife had a second child, and he was just so busy running the clinic that ultimately he was not able to keep up his research into Vince. And if Benjamin was being honest with himself, he knew the Vince Gilmer subject was taking up way too much space in his head. His obsession with this murderer would just have to wait until he had more time to think. In the spring of 2011, 3 years after Benjamin began his research into Vince, Benjamin was in a meeting at the clinic when he received a phone call. The caller identified herself as Sarah Koenig, a journalist from New York. Sarah had heard about the case of the previous Dr. Gilmer, and she was interested to find out more. In fact, Sarah wanted to do a podcast about it. She asked Benjamin if he would be willing to speak with her about his experiences as the second Dr. Gilmer at the clinic. Benjamin was intrigued by Sarah's call, but he was also hesitant. He didn't want to get sucked back into Vince's dark past, so he told her he was actually not interested in doing the podcast. But after he hung up, his old feelings began to resurface. He wanted to move on with his life, but he just couldn't forget about Vince Gilmer. It took another year, but Benjamin would call Sarah back. Now he wanted to be a part of her project if she was still interested. Shortly after Benjamin called in the spring of 2012, Sarah came out to North Carolina and they got to work. Sarah interviewed Benjamin first. To his surprise, Benjamin felt himself tearing up as he talked about Vince's story. It was cathartic for him to finally let out how invested he had become in this stranger's life. Together, he and Sarah planned to interview Vince's old patients, friends, and coworkers. The first person on their list was Vince's old office manager, Terry. She had seen Vince's decline firsthand. So one night, they met Terry in another office space near the clinic. Sarah prepared the recording equipment and then tapped the microphone to test it. Benjamin could see Terry shift in her seat. She was nervous. He understood. He'd felt the same way. Sarah pressed the record button, and the interview began. Terry took a deep breath and described when she thought Vince's personality first started to change. It was about a year before the murder, in 2003. Vince's truck had hit a telephone pole and overturned. First responders found him unconscious, and an ambulance had rushed him to Mission Hospital in Asheville. And when Vince woke up, he didn't know his own name, and he didn't recognize his wife. Terry said Vince's amnesia cleared up after about 24 hours, but after that crash, he was never really the same. Her voice shook as she told Benjamin about how Vince had filed for divorce, moved into a new house alone, started drinking heavily, and began dating random women. He got into debt and spent money he didn't have. Clearly, Vince's mental health had gone steadily downhill in the last year before the murder. And so Benjamin wondered why Vince was even found mentally competent to stand trial. Benjamin decided he needed to see the official documents from Vince's trial in hopes of getting some new insight. The week after Sarah came to visit, Benjamin drove to Washington County, Virginia, where Vince's trial had taken place. He asked the court clerk for all documents available on Dr. Vince Gilmer and received a thick stack of papers, hundreds of pages long. It was the transcript from Vince's trial. Vince had insisted on representing himself in court and argued that he was not in his right mind when he murdered his father due to antidepressant withdrawal. He had stopped taking them cold turkey 2 days before the murder. But Vince didn't present any expert medical witnesses who could corroborate this theory, and he didn't even bring up the bout of amnesia he suffered after his car crash. The prosecution argued that Vince was faking an illness to escape punishment. They presented a psychiatrist who had judged Vince to be perfectly sane the night he killed his father. The jury agreed and found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. Benjamin wasn't sure what to think. On the one hand, a traumatic brain injury and antidepressant withdrawal could explain the dark turn in Vince's personality. On the other hand, he could see why the jury believed the prosecution. Killing and mutilating your father is something a sociopath would do. When Benjamin got back home, he talked it over with Sarah. They both agreed there was only one way to get the full story. The two Dr. Gilmers would have to meet directly. In February of 2013, Benjamin and Sarah made the 2-hour drive to Wallens Ridge State Prison in Virginia. The maximum security building was huge and flat, a cinder block fortress nestled deep in the Virginia mountains. After Benjamin parked and stepped out of the car, he immediately heard the buzzing sound of the electrified razor wire lining the prison's fence. He noticed snipers perched on guard towers. The place made Benjamin extremely nervous. He and Sarah left their belongings in the car, they showed their IDs to the guard, and then walked through the metal detectors. Finally, they were led down a hallway to the visiting area. The room was large and filled with long metal tables. Benjamin could smell old food and bleach. It almost felt like a school cafeteria, except for the fact that prison guards loomed in the corners, and each table had a metal divider down the middle to separate inmates from visitors. Benjamin and Sarah sat down at one of the tables and waited. A few minutes later, an old man shuffled slowly into the room. He was rail thin with a gaunt face and barely any hair. Benjamin watched the old man walk, thinking he must be visiting someone else. But then the old man pulled a chair out at their table. It was Vince. He was 50 years old, but looked nothing like the burly, broad-shouldered man Benjamin had seen in older photos. Benjamin could feel his heart pounding. This was the man he'd been fixated on for the past 4 years. He took a breath and then introduced himself, but it seemed like Vince barely heard him. Vince kept opening and closing his mouth, almost like he was chewing, except he didn't have any food in his mouth. Benjamin could see he was missing most of his teeth. Vince's eyes wandered around the room as he clenched and unclenched his hands. He was trying to speak, but he was clearly struggling. Slowly, Vince began to talk about the voices in his head and how his brain didn't work. After a while, he seemed to run out of things to say. There was an awkward silence, so Sarah stepped in. She followed up with questions that Benjamin didn't have the nerve to ask. Questions like why Vince killed his father and whether he planned it. Vince seemed to expect the questions. He slowly answered that he hadn't planned it. He said the voices in his head told him to do it, but there was just a lot he couldn't remember. Looking at him now, Benjamin felt certain that Vince was not a psychopath. He wasn't evil or manipulative, and he wasn't faking these symptoms. He was suffering, and for years, nobody had believed him. Now, Benjamin had new questions for himself. What exactly was Vince sick with? And was there any potential treatment? Just then, a prison guard walked over and told Benjamin and Sarah that their time was up. Vince stared at them, his eyes brimming with tears, and he asked them to please help him. Benjamin promised he would try, and then he and Sarah said goodbye. They left the prison and drove the winding roads back to North Carolina. About a week after visiting the prison, Benjamin realized he might actually know someone who could help Vince. Benjamin grabbed his phone and he called a colleague named Dr. Steve Bowie. Benjamin knew Dr. Bowie from a nearby medical school where they both sometimes taught classes. Dr. Bowie was a psychiatrist and an expert at diagnosing brain diseases and mental illnesses. Benjamin called Dr. Bowie up and poured out Vince's story. Benjamin told Dr. Bowie that, in his opinion, Vince had been showing signs of some kind of brain disease for at least a decade, and his condition had only deteriorated since he was imprisoned, and if Vince didn't get help soon, he could die. 3 days later, Benjamin drove with Dr. Bowie through the Virginia mountains, discussing Vince's case as they headed back towards the prison. Dr. Bowie didn't think antidepressant withdrawal could be the answer. It had been 9 years since the crime, which meant it had been 9 years since Vince stopped taking his antidepressants, yet his symptoms seemed to have only worsened. There was just no way he could still be going through drug withdrawal after so much time. And Dr. Bowie didn't think Vince's car accident could explain his behavior either. He'd worked with many patients who had traumatic brain injuries, and their symptoms did not match Vince's. Benjamin was confused. He wanted to believe that Vince had been driven to kill by forces beyond his control, but if neither a traumatic brain injury or the Lexapro withdrawal had caused Vince to kill, then what could it be? Maybe, Benjamin thought, Vince belonged in prison after all. After almost 4 years of digging into Vince's case, Benjamin didn't want to believe that he could have been so wrong about Vince. Benjamin sighed, not knowing what to think. Benjamin and Dr. Bowie eventually arrived at the prison, and they parked the car in the prison's parking lot. Benjamin led Dr. Bowie through security, down the prison's echoey hallways, and into the visitation area. Vince eventually walked in, looking just as sick as the last time Benjamin visited. He seemed happy to see Benjamin, though, and he smiled. But then, after he sat down, his lips curled into an exaggerated frown, and he squeezed his eyes shut, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he tried to lay them flat on the table. Dr. Bowie asked Vince questions about the night of the murder, and Vince sort of stumbled through a slow recounting. Dr. Bowie listened patiently, and when Vince finished, Dr. Bowie asked him something that was totally unexpected. He wanted to know what it was like growing up with his father. Vince looked off in the distance for a moment, then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described painful childhood memories. His father was a Vietnam War veteran who drank to excess, especially after returning home from combat, and he was a cruel man who had sexually abused Vince for as long as he could remember. Vince tried to answer more questions, but after a while, a guard came over and said it was time to go. Back in the car, Benjamin asked Dr. Bowie what he thought of Vince. The psychiatrist leaned back in his seat with a thoughtful expression on his face. He told Benjamin that he was more certain than ever that Vince's condition had nothing to do with antidepressant withdrawal or a traumatic brain injury. But he was also convinced that Vince did not murder his father out of pure hate. In fact, he had a new theory for what was wrong with Vince. When he explained it, Benjamin just sat there, stunned. He'd never even considered something like what Dr. Bowie was suggesting. But if Dr. Bowie was right, it would explain everything. They just needed a DNA test to prove it. It took some time, but they did eventually get everything in order. Dr. Bowie had to get the prison hospital to obtain a blood sample from Vince, send it off for testing, and then wait for it to be processed. The DNA results came back a few months later, in March of 2013. Benjamin was at work, sitting in his rusty desk chair, when he saw an email notification on his computer from the prison hospital. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email. The diagnosis was finally there in black and white. It explained everything, from Vince's car accident to his increasingly strange behavior to the murder that landed him behind bars. This is what really happened on the day that Dr. Vince Gilmer killed his father, and why he did it. On the afternoon of June 28, 2004, Vince left the clinic early. He drove home, he grabbed a canoe from his garage and lifted it onto the top of his pickup truck. He strapped the canoe down and then got back into his truck and drove across town. About an hour later, he parked in front of the huge, multi-story brick building where his father lived, Broughton Hospital. Vince went inside and told the receptionist he was there to pick up his father, Dalton. Dalton had been living at this hospital for 2 years, being treated for what doctors thought was schizophrenia and Alzheimer's. His overall health was deteriorating, and so Vince was there to check him out of Broughton Hospital and bring him to a nursing home in North Carolina where he could live out his final days. Vince helped his father out the door and into the passenger seat of the truck. Then Vince got into the driver's seat and he told his father he had a surprise. Instead of going straight to the nursing home, Vince was going to take him to one of his favorite places, a lake in Tennessee where they could canoe together. But while they were making this 70-mile drive to the lake, Dalton started making these horrible sexual comments towards his own son. Unfortunately, this was not anything new. Vince had heard it all before and he could ignore it. But then his father started humming the tune of Baa Baa Black Sheep, the song that Vince's father used to hum while he abused Vince when he was a boy. For Vince, the sound of that song brought back a flood of traumatic memories. It was like a psychological trigger, and in that moment, something broke in Vince's mind. He began to hear voices all around him and inside his head demanding that he kill his father. The more he tried to resist, the stronger they became. The urge to kill his father became overwhelming. His head was pounding and he felt like he was losing control. The tires screeched as he swerved onto the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. The car stopped so quickly that his father's head jerked forward, then back, knocking into the headrest. Vince's eyes locked onto his dog's leash, which he'd left lying over the passenger seat headrest. The voices screamed at Vince to use it. And so Vince grabbed one end of this leash, he wrapped the other end around his father's neck, and then he pulled as tight as he could. Dalton was too sick and frail to fight back. He died of strangulation. Afterward, it was still. All Vince could hear were the crickets and his own breathing. Vince drove around for hours with his father's body sitting up in the passenger seat. Eventually, he pulled over on a rural road in Virginia. It was dark and deserted. Vince knew he'd just done something absolutely terrible, and as he sat in the truck, his heart began to race. The quiet in his head was now replaced by a jumble of whispers and then shouts. The voices were back, and their message was clear. They were telling him he was going to get caught unless he covered his tracks. Vince stepped out of the truck and walked around to the passenger side. He dragged his father's body and left it in a grassy patch on the side of the road. Then he rushed to the back of his truck and scooped up a pair of his gardening shears. He returned to the body, picked up one of his father's fingers, and began to cut. It took some effort because the blades were worn, but in a few minutes it was done. The finger landed on the dry leaves with a soft thud. Then, one by one, Vince cut the rest of his father's fingers off. The voices told him to take the fingers. So Vince gathered them up, got back into his truck, and sped away from the crime scene. A few hours later, a Virginia police officer found Dalton's body while it was still warm. The missing fingers shocked him, but he didn't have any problems figuring out who this victim was. He found name tags from Broughton Hospital in Dalton's shorts and in his shirt. Detectives quickly learned that Vince had picked Dalton up from the hospital that afternoon. Within a few days, police were at Vince's house in North Carolina arresting him for murder. They never found his father's fingers, even though Vince said he dumped them in his clinic's koi pond. But they did find blood-stained paper towels in Vince's truck. When Vince was tried, he had said he was just as shocked by his behavior as everybody else was. And now, nearly a decade later, Benjamin finally understood what was actually wrong with Vince's mind, and he now had the lab results to prove it. Benjamin read the words from the prison hospital's email over and over. Vince had Huntington's disease. Benjamin opened up an internet browser. He'd studied Huntington's in medical school, but it was so rare that he'd never diagnosed it in his career as a doctor. He began looking up articles in medical journals to refresh himself on the details. The articles described Huntington's as being a sort of cross between 3 diseases that are each absolutely terrible: ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. It was a degenerative neurological disease, meaning it caused a person's brain cells to break down and die. This created physical and psychological problems like involuntary movements, cognitive impairments, memory loss, intense personality changes, and psychosis. The Huntington's diagnosis lined up with all the symptoms Vince experienced. And while the majority of Huntington's patients weren't violent, the disease could cause people to act out in ways they normally would not. Benjamin thought that Vince might have been struggling with multiple problems at once. While a traumatic brain injury and antidepressant withdrawal could not explain his actions on their own, they could have combined with Huntington's disease to create a perfect storm of mental and physical illnesses that totally changed Vince's personality and behavior. Benjamin kept reading. Huntington's was genetic, meaning it got passed down from parent to child. If someone's mother or father had Huntington's disease, then they had a 50-50 chance of getting it as well. Suddenly, everything clicked for Benjamin. The doctors at Broughton Hospital thought Vince's father, Dalton, had schizophrenia and dementia. But it was much more likely that Dalton had Huntington's. He was the one who passed it on to Vince. To Benjamin, the entire story was a tragedy. 2 men, a father and son, who shared the same mental illness, both doing unspeakable things to each other. Then Benjamin read something else that made his heart sink even further. Huntington's is a death sentence. There is no known cure, and the disease will eventually kill its victim. All Benjamin could do was try to get Vince the mental health care he needed. Today, Benjamin still has a close relationship with Vince. His goal is to help Vince get out of prison and into a proper treatment facility. In January of 2022, the governor of Virginia granted Vince clemency on the condition that a place was found for him at a psychiatric hospital. Technically, this made Vince a free man, but it wasn't as simple as him just walking out of prison and into a hospital, because every public mental health facility in Virginia refused to take him in, and a stay at a private hospital was far too expensive. Benjamin continues to work hard to find a hospital for Vince, who remains in Wallens Ridge State Prison. He hopes that one day, the first Dr. Gilmer will receive the psychiatric care that he needs. In the summer of 1999, a 33-year-old woman tossed and turned in her bed for hours. Even though she was physically exhausted, her mind was racing a mile a minute. For over a year, she'd been suffering from intense body aches, constant fatigue, and an unbearable itching sensation under her skin. It was like she was constantly battling a severe flu. She'd gone to countless doctors, but none of them thought there was anything actually wrong with her. And some thought what she really needed was actually a therapist. And no matter how much she tried to stand up for herself, nobody would take her seriously, not even her own husband. It had all become too much to handle. And so, tonight, this woman was going to do something about it. Something drastic. In the summer of 1998, 32-year-old Catherine Gordon sat curled up on the couch with a book inside of her home in Atlanta, Georgia. Across the living room, her husband lifted their newborn baby, Jade, out of the bassinet and carried her toward Catherine to breastfeed. It should have been a sweet moment. Catherine thought about how amazing it was that she actually had a baby. It wasn't that long ago that she was a self-described party girl who thought more about the next bikini contest she could enter than about having a child of her own. But now, the former model who once moonlighted as a bartender was a stay-at-home mother with a husband in law school. They were now the model of respectability, and their little baby Jade completed their perfect little family. But Catherine didn't think being a mom would hurt so much. Every time Jade latched onto her breast for milk, Catherine felt a burning sensation tear through her chest. It hurt so much she could feel tears welling up in her eyes. Her husband, John, had tried to reassure her that a lot of new moms experienced difficulties with breastfeeding, and Catherine wanted to believe him. Maybe she was still learning how to do it right. Catherine cupped her hand around the soft, warm fuzz of Jade's head and guided her from John's hands to her breast. The baby tilted her face up to stare at her mother as she began to nurse. Catherine started to smile at Jade's big round eyes, but then she noticed her baby's lips. They were bright red, covered in blood. A bolt of fear shot through Catherine, and she pulled Jade off her breast to get a closer look. It didn't look like the blood was coming from Jade's mouth. Instead, it seemed to be coming from Catherine's milk ducts. She was relieved the baby was okay, but what in the world was going on with her? She called for John and jumped up from the couch to hand him their baby. Then she called her doctor and said she needed an appointment right away. The nurse said she could squeeze her in the next day. By the next morning, Catherine was exhausted. She'd barely slept the night before, between waking up for the baby and also worrying about what was happening with her breasts. If it wasn't for the pain in her chest, she might have fallen asleep right there. But her doctor, the same OBGYN who had delivered Jade a month earlier, could not have been kinder. She asked Catherine questions about her pain and carefully examined her breast to pinpoint where the pain was coming from. She also had Catherine produce some milk for analysis in the lab. Then she smiled and explained that Catherine had mastitis, a bacterial infection that targets breast tissue, causing it to swell. The swelling put pressure on Catherine's milk ducts, which led to the pain Catherine felt when she fed Jade. It also led to the bleeding. Mastitis is a very common illness that affects many new mothers, and it's easy to fix with antibiotics. The doctor promised that once Catherine finished taking the medication for 10 days, she'd be back to normal. Catherine exhaled in relief, but something was still bothering her that she needed to share. She told the doctor that 10 years ago, she had gotten breast implants while she was working as a swimwear model in Virginia Beach, Virginia. At the time, Catherine had been excited to get them. They gave her such a full figure that she won beauty contests all over the region. But now, Catherine wondered if the procedure could have caused any problems with breastfeeding her baby. The doctor promised Catherine the infection had nothing to do with the implants. This seemed like a totally ordinary case of mastitis, and she was sure Catherine would feel better after taking the antibiotics. Catherine thanked the doctor and headed home to tell John, hopeful that she would soon feel better. Three days after Catherine finished her course of antibiotics for her mastitis, she and John sat down to a big meal that she'd prepared. Catherine was feeling great and had put Jade down to sleep with no problems earlier in the evening. The antibiotics had taken away all the pain from breastfeeding, and she'd even felt good enough to go to the gym earlier in the week. It was rare these days that Catherine and John got to spend time alone, and now John was very eager to tell his wife about his busy day. Besides attending law school, John also managed a chain of restaurants and bars, so he was juggling a lot. He had always been a type A personality, never satisfied unless he had a new challenge. Catherine had worked hard too, both as a model and then also a sales rep, but now she was content to look after their home and be with the baby. She sometimes thought that there was something a little invisible about being a stay-at-home mom, but she still cherished this time with Jade, even if she did sometimes feel like she was just her husband's cheerleader. A few minutes into dinner, Catherine began to feel extremely tired. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was only 8 o'clock, and normally she was still full of energy at this time. She tried her best to ignore the fatigue and concentrated as best as she could on what John was saying about his constitutional law class. She told herself that, long days with Jade were exhausting, and probably she just needed more sleep. But when Catherine and John finished eating their meals and they stood up to clear the table, Catherine felt so lightheaded that she immediately sat back down before she fell. As she sat there collecting herself, Catherine realized that her muscles were beginning to ache too. And so she hoped she wasn't now coming down with the flu right when she was finally cured of mastitis. John rushed over to her and asked her what was wrong. Catherine didn't want to alarm him, so she smiled and said she was just tired. He squeezed her hand and told her he would clean up. She should just go to bed and get some rest. Catherine nodded and slowly got up and walked to the bedroom, hoping she'd feel back to normal in the morning. A month later, Catherine limped back into the waiting room of her OBGYN's office. She had tried for weeks to get better on her own, hoping that her healthy eating habits and drinking lots of fresh juice would speed up her recovery, but no matter what she did, it didn't help. She just kept getting worse. These days, her fatigue and aching muscles were making it so hard to get out of bed in the morning, and recently her joints had started to feel hot and tender. Catherine now relied on a group of friends to help her care for the baby all day and make meals, while John started handling more of the house cleaning and Jade's nightly feedings. Catherine felt so guilty. She knew that her mysterious symptoms were making John's life way harder and kind of testing his patience. John was trying to be a good husband and help out around the house, but Catherine found it impossible to keep from criticizing him when he left a dirty dish in the sink or a paper out of place. Catherine couldn't help that she was a perfectionist, and she knew it totally grated on him when she asked so much of him while saying that she was just too tired and achy to keep the house organized herself. Catherine knew something was wrong, and it probably was not mastitis. She was hoping the doctor could help her figure out what was really wrong so she could start feeling like herself again. As Catherine sat on the examining table in her hospital gown, the doctor flipped through the pages of her medical chart and told her what she saw. Catherine's vital signs were normal. Her blood work was normal. She didn't have a major disease like cancer or heart disease, and she didn't have a minor one like mastitis either. In fact, as far as the doctor could see, there was nothing physically wrong with Catherine at all. Then she asked Catherine how she was feeling mentally and if everything was all right at home. Catherine admitted that things were a bit tense these days between her and John, and she explained that her fatigue was making it really hard to take care of her baby. The doctor's expression grew serious, and she sat down next to Catherine. She suspected that her fatigue was due to postpartum depression, a condition that often afflicts new mothers and can be treated with counseling or antidepressants. Catherine was stunned. She did not feel depressed. If she was struggling emotionally, it was only because of her physical discomfort, not the other way around. She told the doctor that when she looked down at Jade and saw her baby smile, she knew that Jade was the best thing in her life. She just needed to get back in good physical shape so she could be the mother she always wanted to be. But the doctor made it clear that Catherine had it wrong. She was confident that the best way for Catherine to get better was to be treated not by her, not by the doctor's office, but by a therapist. Catherine always considered herself the kind of person who speaks up for herself. If someone didn't take her seriously, it made her angry, and she often said so. But this time, as a tired new mom in a hospital gown that didn't quite cover her back, Catherine just fell silent. She thanked the doctor for her concern and then just got up and left. The next day, Catherine was at home playing with Jade on a mat next to the couch. She was dressed in her workout clothes and waiting for a babysitter to arrive. Even though she still felt achy and exhausted basically all of the time, she was determined to get back to the gym. She'd felt good working out while she recovered from mastitis, so she hoped that some gentle exercise would help her get her body back under control. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Catherine let in the babysitter and kissed Jade goodbye, then she slowly headed out to her car to drive to the gym. Once she got there, the familiar sounds of clattering gym equipment and people working out boosted Catherine's spirits. She felt a surge of energy just watching everyone else lift weights and pedal stationary bikes. Catherine took some deep breaths and carefully stepped onto a treadmill. She set the machine to a moderate walking pace and started out slowly, savoring the feeling of movement after weeks of basically being inactive. She told herself it was mind over matter, but after a few minutes, she felt a tingling sensation in her legs and a shooting pain running down her left arm. Catherine kept walking and tried to ignore the pain, but it was no use. Her body was screaming at her to stop. So eventually she pushed the stop button on the treadmill and headed to a bench. She sat down and began massaging her muscles, but that didn't help. Catherine shook her head in frustration. She had barely begun to work out, and now she was already in so much pain that she needed to grab her gym bag and head home. But when she stood up to leave, she felt yet another strange sensation, an intense itching, and it was coming from inside of her chest. Because Catherine could not literally itch the inside of her chest, she reflexively just began tapping on the middle of her chest with her hand, but the itching feeling didn't go away. And so Catherine tapped harder, and then finally she made a fist and just started banging on her chest. But she still felt this unbearable tingling sensation rising up under her skin. Other people now were staring at her as she pounded away madly at her chest. Finally, she dropped her fist in embarrassment when she realized everybody was staring at her, and then as quick as she could, she grabbed her things and headed out of the gym back to her car. Catherine felt helpless. Her whole body seemed to just be falling apart. She knew she needed more help. Maybe a different doctor would have a better diagnosis than her OBGYN, who seemed convinced that it was all in Catherine's head. As soon as Catherine got back home, she made an appointment with her primary care doctor. A few days later, Catherine sat on yet another examination table, this one in her primary care doctor's office. She described her original fatigue and muscle aches and bleeding nipples, but she made it clear her condition was really getting worse and worse. Now she was suffering from weakness and tingling in her limbs, and this weird constant itching inside of her chest. And Catherine was happy to see that her doctor was taking detailed notes as she spoke, and he had a focused, interested expression on his face. When she was finally done speaking, her doctor tapped his pen on his clipboard for a moment, and then he gave her a serious look. He told her he thought she had something called fibromyalgia, which is a disorder that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body and often results in fatigue. Scientists don't fully understand what causes it, he admitted, and there are no real tests for it either. Doctors tend to diagnose patients with the condition when they can't find another explanation for widespread chronic body aches. And although Catherine's doctor didn't actually say this to her, it is the case that doctors will sometimes default to this vague diagnosis, fibromyalgia, when they basically think it could actually all be in the patient's head, just like Catherine's OBGYN had suggested. Catherine's primary care doctor told Catherine that there's no cure for fibromyalgia. He said the best he could do was prescribe her a painkiller called OxyContin to help manage the symptoms. And so Catherine was relieved to finally hear that something was physically wrong with her, even though it was frightening to hear that there was no cure. But still, it didn't seem like all of her symptoms could be explained away by this fibromyalgia. And so Catherine asked if there were any more tests he could run, or anything he could do at all to try to figure out any of the underlying reasons behind her pain. But the doctor shook his head and said no, and then stood up to end the appointment. He said the OxyContin would help her feel better, and that was the best he could do. And so as Catherine left his office, she started to feel like, once again, a doctor was casually writing off her symptoms rather than seriously looking into the root cause. She didn't know if she believed the fibromyalgia diagnosis any more than the postpartum depression diagnosis, and she wasn't sure she wanted to start taking OxyContin, which can be very addictive. Because even if it did help mask her symptoms, she knew it wouldn't actually help cure the underlying reason behind them. She wanted a cure, not just a temporary fix. Still, Catherine was enough of a dutiful patient that she did go to the pharmacy and she picked up the 4 pill bottles that were waiting for her, just in case. 2 months later, Catherine laid on the couch, completely exhausted. She had decided to follow her intuition and not take the OxyContin, but now her symptoms were getting so much worse. The aches were deeper in her muscles, the joint pain felt hotter and sharper, the numbness, tingling, and itching inside of her chest were nearly constant. On top of that, she was getting more tired than ever. She had just put Jade to bed, and now she didn't even have the energy to make dinner. So John was heating up some leftover pizza for them to eat. Catherine eventually heard the beep of the microwave, and so she dragged herself out to the kitchen. She winced in pain as she sat at the table while John silently served them their food. Catherine could tell he was mad, but she didn't really know what to say, so she just sat there quietly while they ate, and then she got up to do the dishes. But Catherine was in so much pain that she had to grip the side of the counter for support. John watched her silently and just shook his head. Then he told her that she had been complaining of aches and weakness for months, but she refused to do anything about it. 2 doctors had given her a diagnosis, but she had just rejected both and refused to follow their advice. He was exhausted too, and at his wits' end, trying to understand what was going on with his wife. In fact, he wasn't even sure there was anything actually wrong with her. Before she could say anything, John turned and walked out of the room. Catherine stood at the counter for another minute and then stumbled to a kitchen chair and just sat there crying for what felt like hours. Finally, she stopped crying and dried her face off with a napkin and told herself that she couldn't give up yet. Maybe there was still an answer for her out there, and even if she didn't have her husband's support, she'd continue to look for answers alone. She had to keep trying for Jade. A few months later, in the spring of 1999, Catherine finally got an appointment with a rheumatologist who was an expert both on fibromyalgia and arthritis. Since that fight with John in the kitchen, Catherine had gone out and seen various other doctors, but none of them had been able to help. But now, as she waited in this latest exam room, she felt hopeful that this specialist could solve her case once and for all. After a short wait, the doctor came in. He was an older man, and although he seemed like he knew what he was doing, she didn't like the way he called Catherine honey. She decided she would forgive his sexism if he could offer her something besides addictive painkillers as a solution. And he did. The doctor began scolding Catherine for not listening to what doctors had already told her. The problem is in your head. He had reviewed her charts, and as far as he was concerned, she didn't have a disease. And until she could accept that and get herself together, her personal life would continue to suffer. Partway through the doctor's lecture, Catherine just stopped listening, like when she was getting scolded as a kid. She felt humiliated and desperate and mad. She knew there was something physically wrong with her, but she was now starting to feel her will to fight slipping away. And she knew the doctor was right about one thing. Her marriage was crumbling under the weight of her sickness. Catherine pushed herself up from her chair and silently left the office. She walked slowly to her car, having to stop periodically to lean against the wall to rest. When Catherine got home, she paid the babysitter and put Jade in the playpen in the living room. Then she lay down on the couch and watched as her little daughter crawled around the space. Jade was nearly 1 year old, and Catherine loved to see her blossoming into a little toddler. But watching from the couch also made Catherine feel guilty and totally inadequate. She wanted to play with her little girl and crawl around on the floor with her, but she just couldn't. Catherine told Jade how beautiful and special she was, but to her surprise, the words that came out of her mouth sounded funny, almost like she was drunk. She sat up straight and tried to speak normally, but again, the words that tumbled out were ragged and slow. And so Catherine thought to herself, oh my God, I can't even talk anymore. Catherine started to feel a rising sense of panic. If her symptoms got much worse, she wouldn't be able to care for her baby at all. As the sun faded, Catherine managed to feed Jade and get her to sleep. She promised herself that she would clean up the baby's mess in the living room, but first she just needed to lay back down on the couch. An hour later, the front door opened and her husband, John, walked in. Catherine was still laying on the couch, tucked underneath a blanket, and she could immediately feel her husband's disapproval as he stared at her and then also at the messy room all around her. John dropped his bag and sat down next to Catherine. He told her enough was enough. It was time to suck it up and get herself together. Catherine felt tears roll down her face, but she didn't have the energy to respond. They'd had this conversation over and over again, and it always arrived at the same place, with John not believing her. And she just did not have the energy to fight anymore. So she just laid there, letting tears stream down her face. John didn't say anything more either. After a minute, he just got up and left. As Catherine lay there alone, she felt something shift inside of her. She'd been fighting with her doctors, her husband, and her body for months. She realized that she'd gotten to the end of her rope. After 10 months of fighting, she felt hopeless, alone, and totally out of options. Catherine could not keep living like this. That night, Catherine dragged herself into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet to get her toothbrush. Her 4 unopened bottles of OxyContin were standing on the glass shelf. She realized the pills would be more than enough to end her life. Catherine closed the cabinet, hobbled over to the bed, and crawled under the covers. As she tossed and turned, she kept thinking about those bottles of OxyContin. She looked over at John, who was sound asleep. She didn't want to leave him and Jade alone, but she just couldn't bear the pain anymore. She was done. Tonight, she would sleep beside her husband for the last time. The next day, she'd make sure Jade was with someone, and while John was at law school, she would overdose on her pills. Catherine closed her eyes, satisfied that she finally had a plan. Then she fell into a deep sleep. But as she slept, Catherine had a strange dream. A jumble of images flickered through her mind, like some broken film reel. She couldn't make sense of what they meant, and then she heard a voice. It was deep and powerful and cut through all the chaos of her dream. The voice told her that there was something poisonous growing inside of her that needed to come out. Catherine bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream felt so real that suddenly she felt like she could taste poison in her mouth. Catherine suddenly knew that she had just gotten a message that could save her life. The next day, Catherine sat in the waiting room of yet another doctor's office. This time, she was meeting with a surgeon named Susan Kolb. The voice in Catherine's dream had told her that whatever this poison was in her body, it needed to come out, like be surgically removed. And Catherine was almost positive she knew what it was. Now she just needed to convince a surgeon to actually perform the surgery. Catherine described her symptoms to the surgeon for what felt like the millionth time. When she mentioned the shooting pain in her arm, Dr. Kolb stopped her. She said she'd seen those symptoms before, and they weren't caused by postpartum depression or fibromyalgia. Dr. Kolb was pretty sure she knew what was making Catherine sick. It was exactly what the voice in Catherine's dream had said it was. But there was no way to know for sure without actually doing surgery. She needed to visually confirm her diagnosis, and no amount of imaging from MRI or CT scans would be enough. She would have to cut Catherine open in the hope that she was right, exposing her to all the risks of surgery from bleeding to infection to organ damage. Catherine felt a surge of fear and also hope. The prospect of undergoing serious surgery was terrifying, but far less so than the prospect of continuing to get weaker and sicker. So she took a deep breath and told Dr. Kolb to please schedule her for the soonest available time slot. Three days later, Catherine lay on an operating table at a local hospital. Dr. Kolb stood at her side and asked if she had any last questions or doubts before they began the procedure. Catherine confirmed that she didn't, and Dr. Kolb nodded to the anesthesiologist. They stepped forward and put some drugs into Catherine's IV. Dr. Kolb waited until Catherine was in a deep sleep before reaching for her scalpel. Then she made a quick incision in Catherine's skin, revealing the fatty tissue beneath. With precise and careful strokes, she continued to cut deeper and deeper. She kept going until her knife was underneath Catherine's pectoralis major muscle, the largest muscle in the chest. There, Dr. Kolb saw what she was looking for: the round implants from Catherine's breast augmentation surgery 11 years earlier. The implants were in the right position, and they didn't appear to have any holes, which was a common problem with implants. But these were not the issues Dr. Kolb was looking for. She reached down and loosened one of the implants and then pulled it out. and immediately Dr. Kolb was shocked at what she saw. The problem was so obvious, the doctor knew right away she would not need to run any additional tests to confirm her diagnosis. The implant was supposed to be full of clear saline liquid that normally keeps it round and firm, but instead, the liquid inside of Catherine's implant was pitch black and full of tiny floating particles. Dr. Kolb quickly switched to the other side of Catherine's chest and removed the second implant, and it too was also black and full of particles. Dr. Kolb told her astonished surgical team that she had found what was making Catherine sick, and the cause was as shocking as it was unlikely. It would turn out Catherine's breast implants were full of a black mold, the same kind of fungus that grows in people's bathrooms. The contamination probably began about 10 months earlier, right after Catherine's breasts began bleeding as she was feeding Jade. She really did have mastitis then, but the antibiotics that her doctor had given her to treat it had caused a brand new problem. The drugs had cleared up the mastitis, but they did their job almost too well. They also killed healthy bacteria inside of Catherine's body that helped protect against other infections. And so as a result, Catherine soon developed this fungal infection that sneaked into her breast implants through a loose valve or seal. From there, the fungus started breeding inside of the liquid saline of the implants and began releasing a steady stream of poisonous toxins back into Catherine's body that were making her very sick. If Catherine had ignored the warning signs from her body and her powerful dream, the implants could have easily eventually burst and killed her. But she listened to the voice in that dream, and it saved her life. Dr. Kolb put Catherine on a 2-month course of a common antifungal medication called fluconazole. After it was completed, Catherine felt much better. It was a long road to recovery, but eventually, Catherine would feel totally normal. She and John were able to work through the relationship issues that manifested during her illness, and they would actually go on to write a book together about relationships. 2 months after her implants were removed, Catherine became pregnant with her son, Cole. She continues to live a healthy life with no long-term effects from her fungal infection. The FDA now requires that breast implant manufacturers include prominent boxed warnings and updated recommendations designed to detect leaks in the implants. In June of 1993, a doctor for the Centers for Disease Control stood on the Navajo Nation reservation in the southwestern United States. He was dressed in a heavy hazmat suit, and he was desperate to take off his helmet and drink some water. But he couldn't afford to take that risk. A fatal disease was spreading throughout the area, and no one knew what it was. But Navajo elders who lived here said the disease was caused by a deadly creature known from their ancient legends. And as strange as that sounded, this doctor was actually inclined to believe them. He knew he had to find this creature and catch it before more people died. On Thursday morning, April 29, 1993, the sun rose over the high desert of Little Water, New Mexico. The air was crisp and the sky was pink as 21-year-old Florina Woody went for a run with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Merrill Bay. Florina and Merrill were both Navajo and lived in a small rural town on the vast Navajo reservation that sprawls across 3 southwestern states. Florina loved the majestic landscape surrounding the town and spent as much time as she could outdoors. And she was especially happy to be outside again after a long, wet winter. She and Merrill jogged along the country highway past small houses and trailer homes set back from the road. In the distance, Florina admired the tall red rock cliffs glowing in the sun. The couple turned off the road and headed up a path toward a flat-topped hill called a mesa. Usually, the top was dry and dusty, but the wet winter had turned it lush and green and scattered with wildflowers. Once they reached the top, they stopped to look down at the town below. Florina could just make out the trailer home that she and Merrill shared with her parents. It sometimes felt crowded living there together, But she was grateful for their close-knit family, especially since she and Meryl were raising their first child now, a 6-month-old son. Florina and Meryl jogged back down the mesa and kept a steady pace the whole way home. Meryl had recently started competing in local races and was always trying to strengthen his endurance. As for Florina, she had reasons to challenge herself too. She'd originally taken up running to offset her asthma, which had gotten better lately. Once they got home, Florina went inside their trailer, she showered, and then she went to relax on the couch. But when she sat down, she noticed her neck and back muscles were aching more than usual. She asked Meryl for a massage, but her muscles still felt sore afterwards. Florina wondered if she might have pulled something during their run, so she tried to take it easy for the rest of the day. Over the weekend and into the following week, Florina's aches and pains did not get better. She developed a cough, too, that felt different than her usual asthma. By Friday, just over a week after she first felt sick, Florina realized her symptoms were not going away with rest, so Meryl made her a doctor's appointment for the next day. On Saturday, May 8th, while Meryl watched the baby, Florina's parents drove her to Crown Point Healthcare Facility, which was located about an hour and a half south and east of their town. It was a commute Florina knew well, since she'd given birth there. Crown Point was a small rural hospital operated by the Indian Health Service with about 10 doctors. 2 of the doctors were a married couple named Christine Golnick and Thomas Hennessy, who had helped deliver Florina's baby. Florina's parents parked close to the entrance and walked with her into the lobby. Right away, Florina saw Dr. Golnick's familiar face smiling at her. Florina smiled back and waved. After signing in, she followed Dr. Golnick to an exam room in the back. Dr. Golnick placed a stethoscope on Florina's chest and listened. Then she held her fingers to Florina's wrist and measured her pulse. Florina watched Dr. Golnick's face for a reaction, but her expression remained neutral. The doctor understood why Florina was worried, since her symptoms had persisted for so long, but thankfully her vitals had come back normal, and so the doctor suspected it was just a bad case of the flu. But considering Florina's history with asthma and her lingering symptoms, Dr. Golnick didn't want to take any chances. She suggested that Florina spend the night at the hospital. In the morning, Dr. Golnick's husband, Dr. Hennessy, could come give a second opinion. Florina resisted at first, since the next day was Mother's Day. She said she wanted to get home and spend it with Meryl and their baby, but Dr. Golnick promised Florina that she could leave once Dr. Hennessy checked up on her the next day. So Florina agreed to stay. She knew that it was better to play it safe, especially because she lived so far from the hospital. She told her parents they could head home for the night, and then she called Meryl. He told her he loved her and promised he'd come get her first thing in the morning once she was discharged. The next morning, Florina woke to a knock at the door. It was Dr. Hennessy, and Florina was glad to see him, because now she was feeling worse and she was struggling to catch her breath. Dr. Hennessy listened to her lungs with a stethoscope and frowned. He told Florina that he wanted to take a chest x-ray to get a better look at her lungs. Unfortunately, that meant Florina would have to stay at the hospital a bit longer. Florina was disappointed, but she was also relieved that Dr. Hennessy seemed to be treating her symptoms so seriously. Whatever was going on with her felt much worse than the usual breathing issues she experienced from her asthma, and she was starting to get scared. A few minutes later, a technician wheeled in a mobile x-ray unit and scanned Florina's upper body. While she waited for the results, a nurse brought Florina a phone so she could call Meryl. And when Meryl answered, he told Florina that their baby was napping and they'd just celebrate Mother's Day when she got home that night. Hearing Meryl's voice calmed her down, but Florina still felt helpless and lonely. This was not how she envisioned her first Mother's Day going. A little over an hour later, the X-ray technician brought Florina's test results to Dr. Hennessy. The image showed Florina's lungs all whited out, which meant they were full of fluid. Dr. Hennessy was shocked by what he saw, and he ran to Florina's room. He found her lying there with her eyes half closed and her mouth ringed with a dry white liquid. She was desperately struggling to breathe. Dr. Hennessy couldn't believe it. For a patient this young and athletic to go from healthy to near respiratory failure in 24 hours was unheard of. The doctor immediately called for a helicopter to fly Florina to the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque, which had a much better equipped intensive care unit. But until the helicopter arrived, Dr. Hennessy had to try everything possible to stabilize her condition. He fitted Florina with an oxygen mask to pump air into her lungs, but within a few moments, she coughed up bloody pink froth. Dr. Hennessy's face turned ashen as he realized what was happening. Florina's lungs were so congested, the extra oxygen was not doing anything. And there was another urgent problem. Florina's blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Dr. Hennessy shouted for a nurse to give Florina IV fluids, and as the medicine entered Florina's body, Dr. Hennessy's eyes shot over to the monitors tracking her vitals. They were still extremely weak. Florina's body just wasn't getting enough oxygen, and her organs were starting to shut down. Getting Florina to breathe was now a matter of life and death. The doctor quickly snapped on a pair of fresh gloves, he grabbed a scalpel from an operating tray, and then took a deep breath to steady himself. And then, when Dr. Hennessy was ready, he carefully cut an incision into Florina's throat and inserted a breathing tube directly into Florina's airway. He heard Florina's heart rate monitor beep rapidly for a few moments, and then it went flat. Florina had gone into cardiac arrest. Dr. Hennessy knew he only had a few seconds left to save her life. He started CPR while the nurse grabbed the defibrillator. Once it was charged, the doctor grabbed the paddles and pressed them to Florina's chest, and then the machine released a bolt of electricity into her body. Florina's heart rate monitor stayed flat, so Dr. Hennessy recharged the defibrillator and sent another shock through Florina's body. Just then, a nurse ran in and told the doctor that the helicopter had just arrived. But, by this point, Dr. Hennessy just shook his head. It was too late. Florina was dead. Later that morning, Florina's fiancé, Merrill, was at home sitting by the baby's crib when his phone rang. He recognized the voice on the other end as one of the doctors from Crown Point Hospital, but the words he was hearing, he just couldn't compute. Something had gone terribly wrong, Florina had died, and no one really knew why. Doctors were running tests, but they had never seen anything like it before. Merrill crumpled to the floor. When he'd kissed Florina goodbye less than 24 hours ago, she'd been a bit under the weather, but it didn't seem serious. He didn't understand how this could have happened. Merrill took a moment to gather himself, then he walked into the kitchen where Florina's parents were having their morning coffee. He tried to tell them what had happened, but the words got stuck in his throat. Then he just closed his eyes, let out a deep breath, and blurted out, "Florina is dead." Florina's parents stared at him blankly. Her mother asked him what he was talking about. Tears started streaming out of Merrill's eyes as he explained what the doctors had just told him. Florina really was dead. It had happened extremely fast, and the doctors couldn't do anything to save her. This time it sunk in, and Florina's parents started sobbing. How could a 21-year-old mother in perfect health just suddenly die? That night, Merrill barely slept, and the next day he woke up in a fog. Food tasted like nothing. He fed and changed the baby, but it felt mechanical. Everything reminded him of Florina. On Tuesday, May 11th, so 2 days after Florina died, Merrill woke up feeling weak and sluggish. He felt like it was something more than the physical effects of his grief, and he was concerned after what had happened to his wife. The doctors still didn't know what killed Florina, and Merrill didn't want to take any chances. However, he had a lot of planning to do for Florina's funeral, and he didn't want to drive all the way to the Crown Point Hospital, so he decided to go to the local health clinic instead. Merrill told the doctor there what had happened to Florina and that he was now feeling sick. The doctor agreed that Merrill was right to be cautious, but he said Merrill's situation was different than his wife's. Florina had asthma, and that likely contributed to her very rapid decline. The doctor told Merrill to rest and sent him home with a prescription-strength pain reliever, an antibiotic, and an antiviral medication. Merrill took these medications over the next few days, but none of them seemed to work. He felt more exhausted each day, and even worse on Friday, May 14th, which was the day of Florina's funeral. Florina's cousin picked Merrill up at the family's trailer that morning, and then they set off for the 70-mile drive south to Sunset Memorial Park in Gallup, New Mexico, where Florina was going to be buried. But they hadn't been in the car long before Merrill started gasping for air. Now, this was before people carried cell phones, so Merrill's cousin had to pull off the highway at a general store to call 911 on a landline. And while he did that, Merrill stumbled out of the car and lurched around in the parking lot, panicking, while his lips and fingernails started turning blue, and then he just collapsed. Paramedics got to the location quickly and raced Merrill to the Gallup Indian Medical Center, and once they arrived, nurses wheeled his stretcher into the emergency room. But by the time he was inside, Merrill had stopped breathing. The physician on duty, Dr. Bruce Tempest, tried to revive him, but it was no use. He declared Merrill dead upon arrival. Later that day, Dr. Tempest sat slumped in a chair, feeling defeated. He had worked at Gallup Indian Medical Center for 23 years and was widely considered an expert at internal medicine. He'd even been awarded the Indian Health Service Clinician of the Year in 1983. But he had felt powerless, being unable to save Merrill's life. As Dr. Tempest signed and dated Merrill's time of death paperwork, an assistant mentioned that the man's fiancée had died too just a week earlier, and like Merrill, she had been in good shape and just declined really quickly. Dr. Tempest felt a wave of fear rise in his chest. Two young, physically fit people didn't just suddenly die of respiratory failure, one right after another. Something had to make them sick. As he thought about Merrill's death, Dr. Tempest realized he'd seen other cases like it. In the past 6 months, he had treated 3 other young Navajos with fatal respiratory issues. He couldn't help wondering if maybe these deaths were all connected. Whatever had killed Florina and Merrill might have killed the others too. The fact that all of the dead were Navajos living within the same general area led the doctor to suspect that this disease might be contagious, and if he had to guess, it seemed like it spread through the air, since the lungs were the most affected organ in every case. If he was right, this could be the start of an incredibly dangerous outbreak. But before he jumped to any conclusions, he needed to gather more information. Dr. Tempest called Crown Point Medical Center, where Florina had been treated before she died. He explained he had treated her boyfriend and wanted to learn what happened to Florina. The doctors at Crown Point didn't hesitate to share a detailed breakdown of her illness. Afterwards, Dr. Tempest hung up and compared both cases. Florina's sounded exactly like what happened to Merrill. It just didn't make sense to Dr. Tempest. He'd never heard of any disease that behaved like this. Also, during this call, the doctor had learned something else that totally puzzled him. Merrill and Florina's 6-month-old son had not gotten sick at all. If this was a contagious airborne disease, the baby would have probably caught it from one of his parents. And why hadn't the grandparents gotten sick either? There was one more thing that was bothering Dr. Tempest. So far, there hadn't been any mild cases of this disease reported. Every single person who got sick died. This disease was unlike anything he had seen before. If it kept spreading, many more people could die. That weekend, Dr. Tempest compiled all the information he could on Florina and Merrill's cases. Then, 3 days after he pronounced Merrill dead, Dr. Tempest phoned the state health department and told them they had a problem. "11 days later, Dr. Jeffrey Dutchin was wrapping up his work at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, where he investigated dangerous outbreaks of disease. He was still in training at the CDC, and the work was demanding. Now he was looking forward to spending the long Memorial Day weekend with his family. But as he was getting ready to leave, there was a knock on his door. It was Dr. Dutchin's boss, and he had a critical job for him. Something troubling was happening on the Navajo reservation. Young, healthy people were dying, and no one knew why. 6 people had already died from this mystery illness, and 4 others had been hospitalized. The CDC was sending out a team early tomorrow morning, and his boss wanted Dr. Dutchin to be a part of it. Dr. Dutchin immediately switched gears and started putting documents in his briefcase. It didn't matter that he had plans with his family. This was urgent. That night, Dr. Dutchin met with the team that was being sent to the Navajo reservation to go over their plan. Once the meeting ended, he was handed a doctor's bag and opened it up to look at the equipment. Along with the regular tools of his trade, he was surprised to find something completely unexpected: a gas mask. Dr. Dutchin knew that it was too early to know what they were up against, but the signs were not good. The next day, Dr. Dutchin and 2 other colleagues from the CDC landed in New Mexico and went straight to an emergency conference of over 30 public health officials. Huge whiteboards lined every wall of the conference room, scribbled with the names of possible germs and toxins, everything from herpes to heavy metals to pesticides and plagues. The mood was frantic. Dr. Dutchin was overwhelmed by all the theories and potential diseases being proposed. Each theory was discussed and dissected. The more possibilities they ruled out, the more worried Dutchin felt. It meant that the cause of death was either something so rare there were very few experts on it, or it was something entirely new. And the longer researchers took to find answers, the more people could die. In fact, on the same day the conference started, a seemingly healthy teenage Navajo girl had collapsed at a school dance at a state park. She died a few hours later. Her death was a stark reminder that the clock was ticking. There was only so much the gathered scientists could accomplish by looking at whiteboards in a conference room. They needed more data. Dr. Dutchin and his colleagues decided to survey some local residents and gather blood samples from anyone who was willing to participate. 2 days after the CDC team arrived, the president of the Navajo Nation, Peterson Za, looked out the window of his office in Window Rock, Arizona. The whole Four Corners area, where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet, and where the Navajo live, had turned into a media circus. News vans were crammed into every available space of the parking lot below. Za's phone was ringing non-stop with calls from journalists, health officials, and locals asking for information on this mystery disease. Za had nothing to tell any of them, but he hoped that would change soon. The Navajo leader was not participating in the CDC's big conference, although he was keeping tabs on their progress. He'd barely slept over the weekend because he was anxiously waiting for any updates. But from what he'd seen so far, he thought the CDC's investigation and the media attention it brought had not been much help. Za's people were terrified, and the outsiders' ignorance of Navajo customs was adding to their panic. Newspapers were printing the names of the deceased right away, even though Navajo tradition forbade their names from being spoken or written for 4 days after they died. This was causing a lot of pain and confusion for the Navajo people. They believed this would prevent the spirit of the dead from properly transitioning to the afterlife. And aggravating the already sensitive situation, some scientists were going right up to people's homes and knocking on the door. They had no idea that Navajo custom required them to wait 30 feet away until they were invited inside. These cultural misunderstandings had led to escalating tension on the reservation, and Za was worried about what might happen next. Just then, the phone rang again. It was a Navajo woman from the reservation claiming that some medical researchers were bothering her family. Za assured her he would be right there to handle the situation. Za hung up, then headed outside. He made his way through the crowd of reporters waiting outside his office. As they shouted questions at him, he promised he'd share any new information with them as soon as he had it. Then he got in his truck and headed to the address the woman on the phone had given him. A few minutes later, Za pulled up to a cluster of low Pueblo buildings that marked the address. The sun was high, barely casting shadows across the dusty ground. Za saw a small crowd shouting at 2 men who were standing off to the side. Both the men looked rattled and confused. Za assumed they were the scientists that the woman had called him about. The situation looked heated, and he sensed it was about to get out of control. Za got out of his truck and recognized the woman who'd called him, and when she saw him, she ran over to him and explained what was going on. The 2 scientists had knocked on her door, asking if her family would be willing to donate blood for testing. Za shook his head in disgust. Now he understood why the crowd was so upset. He wove his way through them and walked up to the 2 scientists. Everyone grew silent as Za introduced himself and explained that the researchers had deeply violated Navajo custom. The scientists' unannounced arrival at the woman's house was considered trespassing by the Navajo people, but even more offensive was their request for a blood sample. The Navajo believe that blood is spiritually attached to the body, and giving a blood sample is seen as a grave violation of privacy. The scientists' ignorance of this cultural belief was an insult to this woman. The scientists' faces turned red, and they apologized profusely. They said they were there on official business researching the outbreak and did not mean to offend anyone. Za cautioned them to be more careful. He wanted to stop this outbreak as much as they did, but if the scientists could not get people to trust them, then they certainly would never learn what caused this disease. The scientists apologized again and packed up to leave. Za calmed the crowd and told the woman to call if any other strange people came around. He had a feeling that there was more trouble to come. Back at his office that same day, Za read the latest news on the outbreak with growing discouragement. The Navajo people weren't just facing problems on the reservation. People in the wider area were beginning to shun them out of fear of the disease. There were several articles about Navajo families being banned from local restaurants and businesses. There was even a report about 27 Navajo third graders from Chinle, Arizona, being denied a field trip to visit pen pals at another school in California. And worse, people were still dying. The death toll was now up to 10, and many more were very sick. Za's eyes locked on one particular article about the outbreak in the Washington Post. A particular phrase in the opening paragraph immediately jumped out at him. It said, quote, "The Navajo flu." He slammed the newspaper down on his desk and rubbed his temples. This had gone far enough. He called in his assistant and told her to schedule a leadership council meeting immediately. The next day, Dr. Ben Muneta, an Indian Health Services doctor in New Mexico, received a call from Za's assistant inviting him to a meeting that night in Window Rock, Arizona, about the outbreak. Dr. Muneta understood why he was being asked to go. His grandfather had been a famous medicine man in the tribe. He had inspired Dr. Muneta to become a Stanford-trained physician with a unique knowledge of both modern science and traditional Navajo medicine. Dr. Muneta had been at the CDC's conference and could be a bridge between their investigation and the Navajo people. He told the assistant he'd be there. As he drove to Window Rock, Dr. Muneta passed a sign nailed to a telephone pole that said, quote, "No media allowed, no newspaper, TV, radio, etc. This means you," end quote. He could tell the locals were clearly fed up with the negative attention. His thoughts turned to his colleague at the CDC, Jeffrey Dutchin. Dr. Dutchin and the other scientists were doing their best to solve this mystery, but they needed help from the Navajo. He hoped that this meeting he was going to have with President Za was the start of that. A few minutes later, Dr. Muneta arrived at Za's office and was led to a small conference room. Dr. Muneta realized this wouldn't be anything like the CDC's giant conference. It was an intentionally small meeting that left out the federal researchers altogether. Za didn't want them interfering in Navajo business. Aside from Za, there were a few senior Navajo medicine men in attendance. The only other physician in the room was the state's deputy commissioner of health. Once everyone was seated, President Za asked Dr. Muneta to update them on how the investigation was going so far. Dr. Muneta admitted that the CDC hadn't found much yet, but they were testing freely given blood samples for all kinds of diseases and working through all the possibilities. Dr. Muneta then turned to the medicine men and asked them for their prayers. The eldest medicine man was grateful for Dr. Muneta's request, but instead of prayers, he offered his own interpretation of the mystery disease outbreak. He believed that too many young Navajo were abandoning traditional practices such as speaking the language and living off the land. They were neglecting ceremonies that were meant to heal the sick, bring good fortune, and celebrate life's milestones. One of the most important of these is called the Blessing Way, which is performed for newborns, brides and grooms, and people who are sick or who have experienced a traumatic event. Without these traditions to keep the world in balance, death was sure to follow. Dr. Muneta could sense the medicine man was holding something back. However, it would be improper for him to press his elder for more information. According to Navajo custom, if Dr. Muneta wanted more knowledge, he had to partake in a ceremony that lasted for several days. As much as Dr. Muneta wanted to adhere to tradition, he knew there was no time to waste. He gathered himself, then sat up straight and looked at the eldest medicine man. In a quiet but very firm voice, Dr. Muneta asked if the medicine man could just tell him more. For a long moment, the medicine man just stared at him. Dr. Muneta felt a knot growing in the pit of his stomach. He knew how upset the Navajos already were that the investigators were violating their customs, And now Dr. Maneta, who knew better, had done it as well. Finally, the medicine man spoke. He acknowledged that Dr. Maneta's behavior was irregular, but considering the gravity of the situation, he agreed to say more. And immediately, Dr. Maneta let out a sigh of relief. According to the elder, this was not the first time a deadly illness like this had struck the Navajo. There had been 2 other bouts of mysterious respiratory failure deaths in their community. One was in 1918, and the other was in 1933. It was a long time ago, but stories were still told among the Navajo about those who had died. Dr. Maneta asked if there had been anything similar about the years in question. The medicine man nodded. Both had been unseasonably wet winters with lots of rain, just like this recent one. Then he described how water changed the land, and these changes in turn brought a creature that carried death. Dr. Maneta knew what the medicine man was referring to. The creature was a real animal that was a prominent figure in Navajo mythology. Navajo called it Na'atsunse and believed it was equally capable of spreading life or death. In Navajo legend, if Na'atsunse entered a home and saw people being wasteful, it would then choose the Navajo's strongest young people to die. Muneta thought about what the medicine man revealed. The doctor didn't think that this animal was literally passing judgment on the Navajo and killing them, and in real life, he'd never heard of it spreading a disease like this through contact with humans. But as he considered the possibility, he came up with a theory that explained how it could happen. And if he was right, it would completely explain this deadly outbreak. Dr. Maneta raced back home and called his CDC colleague, Jeffrey Dutchin, who had led the emergency conference the week before. Dutchin was relieved to hear that the disease was not completely new, but he was confused when Dr. Maneta explained that the outbreak was related to the rain. This land had experienced every type of weather over time. Rain was not unusual, but this disease was. Dr. Maneta told him that it wasn't the rain itself. It was the animal from Navajo legends that came as a result of the rain. And if they were going to solve this mystery, then they would need to find as many of these creatures as possible. Dr. Maneta could sense Dr. Dutchin hesitate, but so far nothing else had worked, and as strange as this theory was about mythical creatures, it was the most promising lead they had. And so Dr. Dutchin told Dr. Maneta he'd get a team together right away. And this time, he'd make sure the investigators respected the Navajo's cultural practices. 3 days later, Dr. Dutchin walked out of his hotel a few miles south of the Navajo reservation. He'd organized this investigation with the help of President Za, and it would be conducted with the help and guidance of medicine men and other Navajo representatives. Dr. Dutchin scanned the parking lot and spotted 4 men gathered around a couple of beat-up trucks. Dr. Dutchin smiled and headed over to them. They were the CDC experts sent to trap the animals that Dr. Maneta had told him about. Another car pulled up next to them, and a stocky Navajo man climbed out. He was an environmental health expert sent by President Za to help with the investigation. He clapped Dr. Dutchin on the back and promised he'd help them find what they were looking for. Dr. Dutchin felt a surge of hope. Thanks to the Navajos, he believed they knew what was making people sick. Now they'd be able to track down that creature that was spreading disease around the area, and hopefully they could figure out how to treat the illness before it killed anyone else. They all piled into a truck and headed for the Navajo reservation. The next day, Dr. Dutchin stood in the middle of the desert. He was dressed in full biohazard gear, a silver suit, airtight helmet, and heavy boots and gloves. He looked across the desert landscape at the other members of his team. They were all dressed in the same protective gear. To outside observers, they might have all looked like astronauts from a movie set. But the work they were doing was very real, and if they weren't careful, it could be very dangerous. Dr. Dutchin was standing above a trap he'd set the day before. Before he checked it, he made sure the wind was blowing away from him to avoid inhaling any harmful particles. If he caught an infected animal, he could be at serious risk for picking up this disease. Once Dr. Dutchin was certain that he was safe, he cautiously bent down and examined the trap. Through the thick material of his helmet, he could hear a faint sound coming from inside, the sounds of a trapped animal. He looked over to his colleagues, who were also examining their traps. Dr. Dutchin hoped that at least one of them had caught what they were looking for. Over the next few days, Dr. Dutchin and his team caught all sorts of animals. They carefully took samples and sent them off to the CDC in Atlanta for analysis. On June 16th, 4 days after the specimens arrived in Atlanta, Dr. Dutchin got his confirmation. The disease afflicting the Navajo wasn't entirely new. It was called a hantavirus. But this strain of hantavirus was entirely unique. The CDC had not been able to identify it earlier because it typically attacks the kidneys, while this particular strain affected people's lungs. But thanks to the tip from the Navajo's medicine men, the CDC scientists knew what was spreading the disease. It was the creature known as the Naatsunse. When Dr. Maneta met with President Za and the medicine men, they told him how this real-life animal played a prominent role in the Navajo's origin myth. According to Navajo legend, the creature is responsible for spreading the seeds of life across the world. However, it can also be dangerous, and its breath can be fatal. This animal is incredibly common in North America, but the Navajo fear it so intensely they burn their clothes if it even touches them. Individually, this animal is not a huge threat, because each one doesn't carry enough of the hantavirus to endanger anyone. But if there's enough of them, they can spread disease like wildfire. In that winter, the heavy rains in the Four Corners area created a concentrated population of the animal that had only occurred twice before, in 1918 and in 1933. In all three instances, the heavy rains had led to more plants and vegetation. This in turn fed the creature and allowed them to multiply. The creature then infiltrated the homes of Navajo people like Florina Woody and Merrill Bay, leaving traces of the hantavirus everywhere they went. The creature that was responsible for spreading this disease was the humble deer mouse. And a hantavirus is a family of viruses spread mainly by rodents. And that spring, deer mice had been all over the Navajo reservation and surrounding area. They crept into homes, they nested in sheds, barns, and storage units. No matter how many holes were plugged or traps were laid, there were just too many of them to stop. And wherever they went, they left their droppings, which carried the deadly virus. When people like Florina and Merrill tried to clean those areas, they came into direct contact with the droppings, and the virus entered their bodies in high enough concentrations to infect them. But now that the CDC knew what was behind the outbreak, local officials could reduce the danger. After the deer mouse was identified as the culprit, public health advisories urged people to avoid rodents and told them how to make it harder for them to enter their homes. And while that didn't eliminate the danger entirely, it reduced it enough to help the outbreak end by the middle of August, almost 3 months after Florina Woody died. All told, 24 people in the Four Corners area were infected with this previously unknown virus. Tragically, half of them died. But thanks to the cooperation between the CDC and the Navajo people, the damage was limited, and there have been very few outbreaks since then. In keeping with the Navajo custom of not speaking the names of the dead, the CDC decided to call this North American hantavirus strain Sin Nombre, which means without a name.